Okay. A combination, a smorgasbord of many local traditions, what the chapter is going to say. The Greco-Roman world was polytheistic. So we mean when just that Greece and Rome, all right, their influence throughout the Mediterranean basin was polytheistic, but not the Jewish people were not polytheistic. What was existing, but remember it's going to spread. Paul and Peter are going to have a big old fight about like who should get the gospel to start out with, and Paul's view is going to win out, and that we need to spread it to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people. And it seems weird because in the New Testament they're fighting about like who you can eat with, but that's not really what they mean. So it's can you eat food that's gotten sacrificed to Zeus, because it would contaminate you. You would be ritually contaminated in the way of so if you're close, if you associate with junk, ritually contaminated. So we've lost this idea today. So I'm going to revisit it a little bit as we go on. So anytime you read about stuff like that from way back when, it's usually not what it appears to talk about. It's about a deeper thing. And in this case, this idea of ritual purity was really important. And Paul is saying we can sort of skip over that stuff because we have something more important right now. And Peter initially was saying no, but then later he got on board, essentially. Okay, so what was going around the Eastern Roman Empire were mystery cults, which is a generic name for the religions that don't publish anything. Especially like how you advance in the religion, what the initiation rites are, and all that sort of stuff. Loosely associated with fertility and regeneration, as a lot of religions were. Greco-Roman background. This is not necessarily just Greco-Roman, but augury. How can you interpret what is to come? Is it the case that you can kill a bird and look at its guts and say, well, you know what? The gods are telling us that this has the potential to happen in the future, that it is going to happen. And we think this is silly, but before you go, I'm so much more advanced than this, either you, or surely not you, someone you know, right, thinks, well, wait a minute now, why is it that every time I wear my Rangers hat and I sit in my Rangers chair and when I watch the Rangers game, that they win, right? But then, like this one time I didn't, and or what other things that may or may not have, where they don't have anything to do with it, but people think that they do, and that somehow you can sort of whip it up, like you can influence it. I'm sort of arguing the basis for sacrifice here. Augury is something a little bit different, and that there is an order here if I can just see what it means, right? And so this is all over the world in all sorts of different forms, right? Throw in the bones. So let's see what the bones tell us, or something else like that. Back before bones turned into dice and craps, right? We're trying to throw a 7. Was important to religious Roman life as a means of predicting future events. The Romans were rather superstitious. As with the Greeks before them, Rome's favorite deities were looked upon as protectors of the household, marketplace, and by the way, we don't talk about the minor ones who people would see more of, which is it's hard to get their religion in context. So the one that cracks me up is it's an older Greek god that the Romans, it might have been in both places at the time. It's Priapus, and it's a sort of a little dwarf, essentially, a miniature god. Except he has a huge phallus, and so I'm saying like the nicer term here. And the Roman men loved putting him up above the doorway because they thought they would get a boy if he was above their doorway. And so the look of houses around Rome would be way different than, it doesn't look anything like ours do today. But in part because that Priapus would be sitting there in the door somewhere, and in his mind, he thought that was a good thing, right? The Roman who was head of the household back in the day. Okay, wide speculation concerning the possibility of life after death. I'm going to say the Greco-Roman background, like the more important part that the chapter's not covering is that it just didn't really fill the needs of people in wars. Populations were kind of starting to come back in this era. People didn't really, well, where is Zeus? I don't see him. Same thing with Poseidon, and are all these just stories, and why are they seemingly important for very important people? So Achilles, right? I need to be like Achilles. Well, like what I need to do is get through my day as a Roman, like as a blacksmith or whatever, right? How does any of this matter to me? And Christianity offered a much better version, or a much more applicable version to people who weren't aristocrats. Or otherwise considered special in the society, and that's that. A lot of Greek stuff tends to reward that excellence, as they will call it. Okay, the initiation rituals for these mystery cults were secret, or just not published, and you can't know what they were. That was part of the appeal. You get to be in on the thing. So I'm going to distinguish this sort of stuff from when the Bible. Well, it didn't just come into being. We had to have councils, people had to agree on the books and all of that. But it's not private. It's public. So much later on, when we hash this out in Christianity, you can train people publicly in ways that won't turn into very different things in different areas. So if you have someone in Egypt leading one of these mystery cults, and he or she has a different idea than somebody on the other side of the Mediterranean, then it starts turning into a little bit of a different thing. And then over time, a lot of a different thing. Okay, so they're listing some of them, the main ones here anyway. A lot of this will go back to, with Mithraism anyway, Zoroaster, light and dark, good and evil. Remember, we're going to Augustine of Hippo is why we're concerned with this for right now. And in Mithraism, you had ritual baptism. You did have communal meal of bread and wine. Their ritual baptism, though the book doesn't, it was really dark. It was the Roman soldiers liked getting baptized into Mithraism, and it was essentially they'd have to pay to buy a bull, and they would. Much like in a shoot today for a rodeo where the bull couldn't really move around a whole lot, they would get under the neck of the bull and somebody else would come along and slit the throat of the bull, and so a baptism in the blood. And that was the stuff back in the day. If you were a Roman soldier able to get initiated like that. All right, Judea before Jesus. Everything this is a really important date here, in the 70 CE, so 70 AD is what we're talking about, when the Romans destroyed the second temple. So the first one got destroyed, but then they rebuilt it, and this destruction changed pretty much everything at the time, because at the time, remember in the Old Testament, that the temple is God's house. Right? From way back when Moses and the children of Israel running around kept God in the tent, essentially. That was where he lived. But see, now they've begun building a temple. So David and then Solomon's really the one that builds the first temple. That you could point to it and say, well, this is where our God is. Right? So when the Romans go in and destroy, not just the first, but the second. So after they rebuilt it, it really caused the Jewish people to reconsider things. So much later on, after this destruction, you can have the rise of what we're going to end up calling synagogues, but they started as house communities and people going to teachings and away from this thing that we have completely forgotten about. And it's that getting right with God through ritual purity, especially sacrifice by buying animals or grain offerings or whatever else is deemed to have been blessed through the temple. So I forget which of the New Testament book starts out like, I want to say, is it Matthew where this is early on? Maybe it's Mark. But Jesus gets really mad at the money changers around the temple. Well, why are you changing money at the edge of the temple? And it's to buy a sacrifice, right? Because in Leviticus, you can go read through Leviticus today if you like, but people took this way more seriously then than we do today, because they said, well, if you did something to upset God, to get away from ritual purity, then what you would do is, if for something minor, you can get a grain offering. But then if you did something bad, you got to kind of keep stepping it up to something more valuable until you get to, say, a goat, an unblemished goat. Okay, well, wait a minute here. Like what constitutes an unblemished goat? Does that mean like all the hair's got to be white and there's no brown spots or black spots, or does that mean something else? Or like who decides what? Well, that's what the priest did, or the Levites essentially, on that outer ring of the temple. So you go there and you buy a goat. If you did something really bad and you sacrificed a goat, a lot of blood running around that area, and this really upset a lot of people, this sort of practice, because of the money. Same thing that upset Jesus, right? All the money changing, the sort of the spirit of everything's getting corrupted in their minds, and so on. And so one of the groups who was so upset about this, so before Jesus' time even, is this, seems like it was the Essenes who formed the Qumran community, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just a separate Qumran group. But they were really upset about this practice, the temple, as was the people associated with John the Baptist, probably associated with this other group called the Essenes, and a bunch of other people that we don't hear about before Jesus, essentially. Okay, so one of the things that for this Dead Sea Scroll community, as I'll call them, they had one of the, you go read these if you want to, by the way. So mostly it's the Bible, and it did confirm that the Bible that we see today is by and large correct, meaning mostly the Old Testament. That there are a few different textual strains. So I think there was the Egyptian, the Syrian, and the Babylonian, which is the one that we get, meaning that's where a lot of the edits happen or changes happen. So there's some slight variations, but it's nothing earth-shattering. But there are other things too besides the biblical scroll. So in one of the scrolls, for example, the people who are running this community, they deemed the area, the physical area that was so close to this temple before the Romans destroyed it, that if you drank from a vessel that was made within so many hectares and like many miles essentially from the from this temple area, if you merely drank from a vessel that was made from clay too close to the second temple, you are now ritually contaminated. And what you need to do is you need to lay in the stream that they had there in the day that would empty into the Dead Sea. This is right on the bank of the Dead Sea. And they'd give you a reed, and you'd have to breathe through the reed for, I forget how many hours. And then staying underwater for so long would get you back ritually pure, and then you could join the group again. Essentially. So people really upset by this second temple, I guess is what I'm getting at, in the practice of animal sacrifice. And by the way, the Jewish people back in the day were really upset with, I'm going to talk about the Samaritans in a minute, but the Samaritans are the other people north of there that have their own temple. This cannot work, right, from their perspective, from the people in Jerusalem. So besides all the other stuff that they're saying that's bad about the Samaritans, that they have their own temple and that they're practicing up there is real thumb in the nose, or whatever you would like to call it. So Jesus comes along to complete Hebrew law. So and we mean to like get away from this sort of sacrificial system that I'm talking about, the old law. So the new wine and the new wineskins, all the new metaphors in the New Testament were turning inwardly, right? So not the outward acts of doing things like sacrifice and praying and all that. So if you just keep that in mind, if you read through the New Testament, we're doing something different. We're going in a different direction. So the people at the time they'd heard this in part, especially through prophets of the old that stayed in the area in Palestine and were not from Babylon. So we mean especially like Amos in the Bible, Jeremiah, and not Ezekiel, who was one in Babylon. Right? And so these ones from the people who stayed as a conquered people, in other words. And they said, well, it can't be a God, we don't need to necessarily worship a physically powerful God. It must be more of an inward thing. And so this in the Beatitudes or the blessings, blessed are the poor in spirit. Okay, so he's not saying blessed is the Levite who came down, who didn't help the Samaritan, and then he's the Levite because he didn't want to become ritually impure, was what the Levite would be thinking in that story. And so we tend to poo-poo the Levite because we don't really understand the context at the time. It would have, the Levite had to go do things that he thought was important, like I guess like pick out what the animals were you could sacrifice, or something along those lines. Okay, so why do the Romans care about this? Well, first of all, it's not just the Romans. It's the Romans would kind of subcontract out to the Jewish authorities, right? So when the authorities at the time bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate, who's the ranking Roman person, right? Remember, they're upset with him first. But what people can see is, well, wait a minute. Why is it the case that you won't just you won't say our emperor is the God? Like, that's all we're, just say it. Just say it. Start, go through the motions. That's probably going to be enough for us. Jewish people wouldn't do it at the time. So, problem here, there were other problems at the time. And remember, all of this is before 70 AD. And so finally, the Romans are going to get really upset and just raise the entire area. Okay, but this idea of the good shepherd that shows up in Christian, just realize this is a really old concept. So they hear it a little bit later. This is obviously after Jesus, but the good shepherd for the Romans, or the Greeks in this case, right? Going back to 300 BC. Oh, no, it's 300 after the fact here, but you can find them as far as like Greeks or Romans before in the BC time period, no problem. So they're picking the ones after that here. Okay, Paul, co-founder of Christianity. Okay, Paul is incredibly important. So people say things about Paul. So he was not necessarily the guy you want in a car with you on a long trip, because he seems incredibly obsessive, right? But what was he obsessive about? Spreading the word, right? And he did a very good job of spreading the word, all section in his world in his lifetime anyway. So one of the things I want to point out about Paul is this idea of original sin that had entered the world through Adam's defiance of God in the Garden of Eden. So it's there with everyone, and Jesus had to pay as a sacrifice, right? In the Pauline thought here. But when Paul is saying this, and he's writing this down in various versions in the New Testament, this is going to have real resonance, right, with, again, Augustine of Hippo, that we're going to talk about here coming up. All right, and so never also forget, tent maker by occupation, Roman citizen, and so he has rights and he privileges that other people in the world do, and education that other people do not at the time.